Well, good afternoon and welcome. My name is Joe Swimmer. I'm the Executive Director of Episcopal Parish Network, and we are so pleased to have you with us here today to talk about preaching in a post-Christian era. This is a follow-on to a conversation that was recently held at the parish of Calvary St. George in New York, the rector of which is participating here. Jacob, welcome. Glad to have you here. And in partnership with the Living Church Foundation, we are so pleased to have the new head of the Living Church Foundation, Matthew, here to facilitate the conversation. On behalf of Episcopal Parish Network, welcome to this Advent offering on preaching. We hope that is helpful for you all. If you are not a member of Episcopal Parish Network, I've put some information about us into the welcome and would invite you to find out more. Also, please don't forget to join us in Houston next March 6th through 9th for our 39th annual conference. We're looking forward to seeing many of you all there for a wonderful time in Houston. Warm weather for those of you who happen to be in the Northeast during the winter. So as Elizabeth, who's in New Orleans, can attest to. So without any further ado, welcoming Matthew, Jacob, Elizabeth, and Matthew. We've got two Matthews. I'm going to hand it off to Matthew to pick up the facilitation. Thanks so much, all.
Great. Thanks so much, Joe. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great privilege to be partnering here with Episcopal Parish Network. And as he said, my name is Matthew Olver. I'm the new Executive Director and Publisher of the Living Church Foundation as of September 1, so just a few months. And it was one of the first things I was able to do was participate in this event that I had nothing to do in planning, but was just able to enjoy and participate in at Calvary St. George in New York City with Father Jacob Smith, one of our panelists. I think he just celebrated his the anniversary of his ordination just a couple of days ago, and I think he and I have been ordained almost exactly the same period of time. So about 18 years, is that right?
That's right, absolutely. 2006 on the feast of the, absolutely. Yeah, December 6th, 2006.
December 6th, yeah. So it's great to have Jacob with us. Our second panelist is Matthew Hoskinson, who's the director of City Ministry Program, as part of Redeemer City to City, and also in New York City. Matthew spearheads the urban pastoral training and education through the City Ministry Program, which is a really exciting, innovative, integrated learning environment that blends biblical and theological study with real life experience in the city. And City to City, for those of you who don't know, was founded by Tim Keller, who's the longtime founding pastor of Redeemer Presbyterian in New York City, one of the great public pastors of our day. And as you probably know, he died earlier this year and leaves a tremendous legacy in New York City and well beyond. Matthew was also one of the presenters at our conference, and it's a great pleasure to have him as one of our panelists. So thanks, Matthew. Welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
And our last panelist is Dr. Elizabeth Kincaid, who is La Legendre Soule Chair in Business Ethics and the Director of the Center for Ethics and Economic Justice at Loyola University in New Orleans. And I should add that she and her husband Thomas are two of my dearest and longtime friends. She and I were colleagues together in Neshoda House for a number of years, and both of us remain affiliate professors there. Her areas of research are virtue ethics, Jesuit moral theology, and Catholic social teaching. She's published, lectured widely. Her first monograph, Law from Below, How the Thought of Francisco Suarez Can Renew Contemporary Legal Engagement, will be out from Baylor University Press in weeks. In time for Christmas or no?
Actually, it's from Georgetown, but not
from Georgetown.
But you can pre-order. So then your friends will get a lovely surprise in about February when it arrives.
Yeah, this is the thing that most children want to receive in their stockings, a note that they're going to get a book about Suarez.
Realize how lucky they're going to be to receive this.
Exactly, exactly. Let me introduce myself briefly. Matthew Olver, as I said, the new Executive Director of the Living Church Foundation. Like Jake, I've been a priest for about 18 years. I spent the first 8 of those in Dallas in parish ministry. I spent the last 10 years as the liturgy professor at Neshoda House. My area is early Latin liturgy, development of the Book of Common Prayer. So it's a real pleasure to moderate this event and partner with Joe Swimmer and his team at Episcopal Parish Network. So be sure to check out all of the other events and conferences that they offer, especially their conference coming up this March. Living Church has a lot coming up as well. livingchurch.org/events. You can see that. So the Living Church, as you probably know, is one of the old Episcopal institutions. It has the oldest continuous publication in the Episcopal Church, Living Church Magazine from 1878. But we do a lot of other things. I've started to say when I go around giving talks that the Living Church is a very small media company with a really big mission. I don't know if that works or not, but I'm trying it out, and it seems to be working. One of the many things we do, in addition to the magazine, the Episcopal Musician's Handbook, which is in like 40% of Episcopal parishes, considering what we're talking about today, we have a really great preaching aid called the Living Word Plus. Comes to your inbox at the beginning of every week. It has theological reflection on the readings. It has at least 3 contemporary sermons on these texts. It has at least 3 classic sermons from sort of either contemporary preachers or from the tradition, essays on the week's themes, and then also special content for the feast days that are coming this week. So if you're interested, we're happy to give everyone who participated 3 free months. So I just dropped info on the chat about that, but you can go put in the coupon code and try it out for 3 months and see if that's helpful to you. So enough shameless self-promotion from all of us. So let's get to our conversation. Our topic is preaching in a post-Christian age. And my guess is that not everyone listening might even agree that our age is post-Christian. And for those who do agree, we might really describe what that means in different ways. So my first question, I want to begin with one of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite professors from seminary, Stanley Hauerwas, who's friends of a number of us, I think. He has a very famous way that he quotes himself probably hundreds of times, and many people have quoted him, describing the contemporary person in the West in this way. Stanley writes this. He says, "My way of putting it is that we live at a time, you may call it modern if you so desire, when we believe that we should have no story except the story we chose when we had no story." I'll repeat that. We live in a time when we believe we should have no story except the story we chose when we had no story. And we call this freedom. Stanley goes on to say, abundant life, the life that Jesus offers, is a storied life made possible by a common life that recognizes that before we were storied by a story we didn't choose. It is called creation. It's called redemption. It's called salvation. It's the story of redemption that makes possible friendship between strangers, just to the extent that we can learn that we share a common story that we did not choose. So I'd like each of you to answer, why do you think, if you do think, that post-Christian is an accurate description for our day? And do you think Stanley's description is helpful in thinking through this question? Elizabeth, let's start with you.
Thank you, Matthew. And I love that quote. I'm going to make what may be a slightly Stanley-like move myself, and I'm going to argue that what we really are is post-Christian. And the reason I'm going to say this is in the last year, I've gone from teaching Episcopal and Anglican seminarians to teaching undergrad business students in New Orleans. And what I have seen is that the statement that these students, 18, 22-year-old, feel like the only story is the story they've chosen for themselves, I think that's absolutely true. But they're not content with that. That doesn't satisfy them. I was just grading final essays right before this webinar. This was such a nice break. And one of the things that jumped out to me is that most of the essays focused on our class discussion around human flourishing and the idea that there are certain stable components of human nature that contribute to living a flourishing life, family, friendship, meaningful work, and that the students feel adrift on their own freedom. I don't think they're necessarily ready at the point to turn to the Christian tradition to find the answers, but that what they feel is that this ability to completely craft our own stories, our own narratives, doesn't satisfy. It's not making them happy. And they are hungry for something more. So that's why I'd like to say we are post-Christian, and that they are thoroughly formed in these ideas, but they are seeking.
That's great. And I love that, adrift on their own freedom. That's a great phrase. And I bet Stanley would love that.
I hope so.
What about the rest of you? Tell me what your thought is on this sort of post-Christian description, and then if you think Stanley maybe is helpful in thinking that through, or even helpful in thinking about how you preach.
Yeah. Well, I think preaching in a post-Christian age was just a great I think advertising thing. But I do agree with it, and I think when Stanley goes on to say about that we believe that our story is the only one that matters, actually ultimately is cruel and leads to despair. And I think that's oftentimes very evident, especially in a city like New York. But I think why we're not living in a post-religious age. We're more religious than I think we've ever been. We've just transferred a lot of our religion into politics, as opposed to, and so our gods fight in Washington, D.C., whether you're blue or red, and we all have our champion. But we're just as religious as ever. There was a study that just came out that more people are worried about their children marrying a person like if they're a Republican, they're worried they're going to marry a Republican or a Democrat more so than they are someone from the same religion. So this tells us that we're just as religious as ever. But I would say that we could say that we're in a post-Christian context in many ways. I would say is because most people don't know the story of the Bible at all. There's all sorts of studies going out. English professors, there was an article in the Washington Post, I think back in 2015, English professors are having a hard time teaching Shakespeare because there's so much Christian context within the writings of Shakespeare that the students who don't have any fundamental biblical knowledge, even working biblical knowledge of it, can relate to the stories. And so I think we're in this age where I would say it's post-Christian because, every age we have an obligation to evangelize and to make disciples of all nations, but this is a unique age I think we're entering into where people aren't familiar with the basic story at all. You know what I mean? They wouldn't even, there came a man named John. Is that John the gospel, or who is, you know what I mean? People don't understand these basic distinctions. And I think that's the powerful point of preaching in a post-Christian age, is because the job of the preacher then is to remind, as Stanley would, I think, argue, say, well, you've been given a story. That's the point of the book of Hebrews. That's actually the point of Paul's point in the book of Romans. You have been grafted in to this great story that begins with creation, fall, redemption. And so this becomes the task of the preachers to share this good news and to bring them in so that they might begin the eyes of their heart might be open to the fact that God has invited them. I love that. It's not very interesting that you've invited God into your life. What's really interesting is that he's invited you into his. And he's given you this wonderful, marvelous story that has a glorious, glorious end, which is actually a new beginning.
I would simply, I'm in full agreement. I love the way Elizabeth and Jake have stated this. Before I pile on and build on what they've already constructed, I have the chat window open, and I'm just so overwhelmed with gratitude for each name and each church and parish listed there. It's just what a delight this afternoon to just get like this infusion of there's life here and here and here and here and here and the Spirit at work in all these different places. So thank you, all of you who are watching, who are taking time out of a busy Advent season to listen to the four of us talk about preaching. I mean, it's just, I am so overwhelmed with gratitude, even for your life, for your participation, for what you're doing. I just want to be your biggest cheerleader this afternoon, because the work you're doing is so vitally important, even if it feels like it's not fruitful right now. Trust the Spirit. You are right where God wants you, and I love it. Okay, back to the question. Perhaps another way of looking at it, when I hear even when I heard like the title "Preaching in a Post-Christian World," the way I hear that is a post-Christendom world.
Mhm.
And this kind of resonates with what Jake was just saying, is that it's post-Christendom in the sense that we cannot assume that some furniture is already present in the room. Like, we have to bring some furniture in the room in order to begin the conversation about faith in Jesus. In my more hopeful, optimistic moments, I would like to say we're in a pre-Christian world. Like, we might not have even seen what a Christian world actually looks like, looking at some of our own church history. And I have high regard for the history of the church and where we've been, but there's a sense in which maybe the world is actually pre-Christian. That would be in my really, really hopeful, optimistic moments. But I think where that translates for us in the praxis of ministry and the praxis of preaching and of interfacing with our friends outside of our churches and outside of our parishes is that, frankly, the God that many people say they don't believe anymore might not actually be the God of the Bible. So I love this line. It's not original with me by any means, but it articulates the point well. In speaking with a skeptical or agnostic or a lapsed believer, say to them, describe the God you don't believe in, because I might not actually believe in that God either. Let's talk about who the God of the Bible, what the self-revelation of God is in the scriptures, and you might just be surprised, as C.S. Lewis was, by the way.
You know, there were two strands here I want to pick up on. It sounds like story is I think it seems like all of us think this is helpful in a number of ways. And I love, Matthew, what you said about another metaphor here, that maybe we actually have to bring a bunch of furniture into the room so that when we tell the story, there's actually a context in which the story can make some sense. I think that's it's a mixed metaphor that works in this context, I think, well. And I think, I don't know if it was you, Matthew, or somebody who brought up, I think Tom Wright's like classic 5-act play as one way of summarizing the sort of Christian vision of the history of the world, or one way to put it. And I'm wondering what some of you think the furniture that we have to bring in to help make the story make some sense. And what are some of the ways of summarizing the story that you have found really fruitful, whether in a sort of one-on-one context, or as you're preparing to preach, that you're sort of using a frame to address this particular text?
I'll go ahead and jump in. And I think because that metaphor really resonated with me too, as I'm thinking about how I preach. So it's, I will say, I think one of the things I am learning is that we need to bring the furniture in the room. And my assumption about what furniture is already in the room, as I guess now well into middle age, mid-career academic, I need to spend a lot of time examining that and listening, because I can miss what furniture is in the room. So one of the things I was thinking about this summer is we had a number of students go to World Youth Day, which was a big Roman Catholic international youth gathering. And they did a huge emphasis on the environment, which is one of Pope Francis's signature concerns. And the students came back and they said, yeah, that's great, but we already know God cares about the environment. This wasn't news to us. What they wanted were some basics of the faith that they hadn't received, to Jake's point about people not knowing the basics of the story. So what, for me, and what I teach in my ethics classes, and, hey, as Christians, we have an obligation to care about the environment. We have, not all Christians believe this, but this is something I came to appreciate perhaps later in life for these 19-year-olds and 21-year-olds. Well, yeah, this is kind of like, duh, I know that about the environment. I'm not concerned. But the two pieces of furniture that I find as I listen that they do need, and again, this is, I'm teaching and preaching in university context, sin and redemption. And sin is such a relief to them because they know they live in a broken world. They know they've been hurt and they know they hurt other people. And the idea of a category saying, hey, there's something broken about all of us, that's freeing. And then the idea that there's forgiveness and that there's grace. These are students who are consumed with anxiety, who feel that they need to live perfect lives. The things that to me, I've heard since I was in middle school youth camp, sin and redemption, that's the furniture they need. And so I feel like I'm constantly in this process of asking and learning and having my own assumptions refined about the furniture that's already in the room.
I would echo that. My wife is a therapist, and a lot of the people she works with are college students, and this is the sort of thing she says over and over, that naming what has happened to them or the things that they have done, being able to call it something like that, there's something really powerful in that. And then when she says, how many times has she described how she said, and that like you can be forgiven, or like you can, like the power that you have to forgive someone who has done something to you is, and it's often just sort of like earth shattering. So I so appreciate that.
Yeah.
Jake or Matthew, I don't know if you have anything.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. Here at Calvary Church, this is actually one of the churches in the parish. It's the birthplace of Alcoholics Anonymous, the spiritual points of the 12 steps. And one of the great things, and I mean, that's one of our ministries, is trying to bring the basement into the nave. And so, and that is kind of that old reformational category as well of talking about law and gospel, law and grace. And, everybody knows that something is deeply, deeply wrong, and Jesus takes that teaching on the Sermon on the Mount and raises it to its highest pitch. You have heard that it was said this, but I say unto you. And I think we live in an era where, everything is permitted, but nothing is forgiven.
Yes.
And people know that is deeply, deeply wrong. They know there's something deeply off. And I think that this is the powerful thing about preaching in this current context, is that you can affirm, yes, something is off. And then you can begin to take that back to the very beginning of the story. You know what I mean? And the fall act there, this is in every person's story. But yes, there is good news in this. And this really should be the crescendo of the sermon in the preaching of the post-Christian age. A lot people have so much stuff going on in their life. The last thing they need is you to tell them a little more they should be doing for Jesus. What they ultimately need to hear day in, day out is that it has been done for you in Jesus. And that's ultimately the good news, is that he's laid his life down for you. He's coming again for you. He's risen for you, and he's coming again for you. That's the mystery of faith. And when you begin to preach that, well, it ties in beautifully, right, where they're met by the sacraments. And so I think that so then they get a tangible expression of this grace and this forgiveness and love. But I think that is something that people are dying for, because everything's permitted, but nothing's forgiven. And I have a word for you. You have been forgiven in Jesus' name. That's one of the powerful points that's come out of the 12 steps, is this idea of forgiveness. And I think the church needs to recapture that in their preaching.
Yeah, the only sin and redemption, the law, gospel, one other way to look at it, beauty and brokenness. Like it's ultimately impossible for a secular worldview to account for beauty and brokenness. The problem of evil is a problem for everybody, not just a problem for Christian theology. It is a difficulty for Christian theology, make no mistake. But secular thought has nothing. Why is there justice? What justice doesn't mean anything ultimately. Like it can't in a secular mindset. So being able to draw on our innate sense that there is beauty and our lived experience that there is really profound brokenness, and walking into that, and then walking with a person from there to the very human life of Jesus. I mean, the divine human one who himself lived the life that each one of us has failed to live. So no matter what command there is in the law, you can look at the life of Jesus and see it fulfilled in him in a way that I'll never measure up to. Like, so the law crushes me, but then it brings me to Jesus as the fulfillment of that law, and then the one who died and rose again for me. So beauty and brokenness becomes just a helpful lens that is a little less churchy language, perhaps, but then can move you right towards a story of redemption in Christ.
Yeah, I mean, I think that how essential it is in sermons to speak about what God has done and what is doing. I remember talking to a friend who was at a church, and he said he ended up finally having to leave. Every sermon ascended to the kind of semi-Pelagian or Pelagian apex of what we were going to do for God.
Yeah,
and
I call them salad sermons. Let us.
He was like, I'm just exhausted.
Us.
Like, I'm working so hard in so many ways every week. Like, where's God in this? How is he sort of helping here?
Yeah.
How is he helping?
I think that's a great point. A lot of preaching today has made God the passive agent, as if he's some sort of I've noticed we have some folks from Fond du Lac and Eau Claire here, Matt Gunter. But it's made God this kind of like passive being who's just up in heaven waiting for us to ascend so that he might say, oh, there you are. No, I mean, the story of the Bible, and this is the testimony of the apostles, and it came out in their preaching, just read the book of Acts, is that God is the active agent in the relationship. He's the protagonist, and he's the one making all of the moves. I mean, I see this beautiful question here from Stephen Smith. So what is the good news? Well, the good news, St. Paul says this clearly in his Corinthians letter. He says, this I proclaim to you of chief importance, that Christ Jesus died and was raised from the dead, and for our justification. And then he appeared to me and a bunch of other people. So this is real. And what God has done is real. And what does redemption look like? Well, it begins to through the preaching of the word and the administration of the sacraments. I mean, it begins to produce fruit in your life because it's the Spirit at work. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And that becomes the tangible reality until we actually, as our liturgy says at the burial rite, we see him face to face, but not as a stranger, as a friend. But I need to be kind of always reminded of this because, the truth is that the redemption, the tangible reality, as Paul would say, my life is hidden. And so I need to, you need to hear the God of Israel speak. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. Faith comes by hearing. And this becomes the important work of the preacher, is to not just give some insights, but to actually give people Jesus, to see that as when you preach the forgiveness of sins and you deliver the gospel, that is actually a prophetic, profound act by which Jesus meets people today.
And I just want to, as a moral theologian, I'd be remiss if I didn't, I don't want to give up on law. And I don't want to give up on moral formation. But I think if we're talking about preaching in a post-Christian world, like Jacob was just saying, the first thing people need and what they need to be constantly reminded of is called back into this relationship with Jesus, received through the word, the grace received through the sacraments. And only from that starting place can we begin this work of cultivation of the virtues, intentional formation and growth. And that is a lifelong project carried out in communion with the church. And I do think realistically, for us to kind of come in and say, gosh, I'm an occasional lay preacher. I'm not preaching every Sunday at a church, but to come in and assume our preaching can do all of this all the time. This is where we need the whole church functioning in teaching, in formation, in service to the poor, an integrated approach. But what people hear when they walk into a church is the preaching. And if they don't meet Jesus in that preaching and reminded of God's action, reminded of who God is and the reality of God's presence, and God's love for them, we don't even get to the rest of it. And that's just.
Yeah. That reminds me, I once heard Rowan Williams asked a question. This was soon after the Regensburg Institute with Pope Benedict. This was like 15 years ago. And Rowan Williams was asked, Your Grace, would you discuss the difference between Christianity and Islam? And the point was to try to trip him up and so that he would say something stupid. This was Rowan Williams, so that was probably a bad idea. But the answer that he gave, I thought, was so beautiful, in part because he didn't use any technical language. He said, in Islam, God is first encountered as law. This is what it looks like to be in relation, to know me. And he said, in Christianity, God is first encountered as relationship. He is a relationship, and he invites you into that relationship. And in that context says, this is what it looks like to love me. He used no theological terms, and yet he was able to describe
powerful
in such a beautiful way and a relational way the nature of the Christian encounter. Jake, you had mentioned about sort of transformed lives, and one of the things that stayed with me at the conference, Bishop Jenny Anderson, who's now the rector of St. Paul's Bloor Street, but she was one of the assisting bishops in the Diocese of Toronto. She spoke quite strongly about what is necessary in the life and discipline of the preacher in order for them to be an effective preacher and to be able to be a vessel that God can use. So I'm interested in what sort of things that you've identified as just essential for you in helping you to develop the kind of character and discipline that's necessary to be a faithful minister.
Gosh, that's a great question. And, I wish I was half as disciplined as Jenny, Bishop Jenny. So, but
Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the main things that I do is I try and stay rooted in the text, not just the daily offices, but the text itself that I'm going to be preaching on that Sunday. I try and get in and live in it, and through that look through for illustrations in the culture and all around. But and I try and my best to stay connected to the grand story. So working my way through the scriptures as a preacher, I think it's a very important. One of the things that I do is to be a student of the Bible and to just stay reading the story and what others have said about the text, because it's not just me and my Bible. It's there's a great tradition that we're working from, and so that's one of the things that I personally try and do as a preacher, is to stay rooted not just in the Bible itself, but in the text of the Sunday, but in the great story as well that it's trying to teach. And where does it fit in? I think oftentimes it's a problem in preaching today is we pull something out and we forget that it belongs to. So you don't have to begin in Genesis and end in Revelation every Sunday, but you need to have a familiarity of that, where it fits in that framework, and where it fits. If you're preaching in the life of Jesus, where is he telling this parable in relation to his death and resurrection? Where is this occur? You know what I mean? And so where is Paul at, and who is he speaking to in this particular moment? And why would he, for example, in Romans, use Abraham and David as his illustrations of covenant relationship? And and so why would Moses, when we're walking through the book of Exodus, appeal to Abraham as to God when the people had the calf down below? So what's going on in this great story, and how is it connected to what I'm talking about, and how I'm going to give the goods that Sunday morning?
What about the rest of you, about sort of discipline and even ascesis in our lives to make space to hear the voice of God?
Yeah, I think as it relates directly to preaching, St. Paul's admonition to the young Timothy that the hardworking farmer must be the first partaker of the crops.
Mm.
It's against our instinct as ministers to let me change the metaphor. Uh, put the oxygen mask on ourselves first, and then help the ones around us. We are surrounded by chaos, and generally, the people in our churches and our parish come to us only at times of chaos, and otherwise might want to be left alone. Thank you very much. Hey, I sent in my offering. Okay, you good? I'm like, stay away, right? But so we're constantly always dealing with the chaotic things, and so we can live in this swirl of constantly needing to like, what word do they need, and how can I serve them, and we run out of oxygen ourselves. And I think St. Paul's admonition there is saying, look, eat the food first. It's for you first.
Mm.
So I know, I mean, the rigor of preparing engaging, rich, theologically sound, uh, maybe evangelistic, maybe funny, maybe serious sermons week in and week out is really, really hard. It takes a lot of work. And so it can just be so simple to skip to, God, what do these people need to hear from from the readings this Sunday? Instead of starting with, I want to put in a lot of work this week. Holy Spirit of God, I need to hear your voice in these readings for me before I can start distributing to other people. So I think that posture can just help to orient your own heart to your own need for Jesus, to keep you from a savior mentality. Face it, probably a lot of us got into this business because we have a savior mentality, at least a little bit. Or maybe a little bit of, enmeshment with people or codependency or whatever. So let's just name that. But so we come back to know what I need, Lord, is you. I need you. I need your word, your spirit active in my life so that I can be enabled to give this freely to others.
Yeah, I mean, Bishop Greg in his opening sermon at the conference, one of his points was the first question is what is the word to me? What does God need to say in my life, as opposed to, what do I think God needs to tell them? But what do I need to hear, and what is it saying to me? Elizabeth, it looked like you were maybe ready to say
I'm just
something.
going to add something. I love everything everyone else said. The other gift to me is friends. And I have been so blessed in my ministry with friends who aren't in my own ministry context, who preach to me through their friendship, and can say to me, hey, here's like to your point about, preach to what's God saying to me first. Having those friends who can say to me, hey, this is what I'm seeing in your life. This is what I do think you need to hear. That has given me just such riches to draw on. I'll say I saw Father Walter's question about stories that connect the biblical story of salvation, liberation, and our current struggles. I mean, the other people that have spoken to me are the saints in this. When I am looking at my own life, having, someone I resonate with a lot is, as a woman theologian, is St. Teresa of Avila, for example. These figures in the tradition that I can turn to, who both through time and in my current life and my current age preach to me through their writings and through their friendship. Matthew, I don't know if you remember this. One time at Nashotah, I had forgotten that I was supposed to preach, and you asked me right as we were walking into chapel.
I remember this.
Yeah. And I went and sat up there through the prayers and I listened to the lessons. And I think I preached a pretty good sermon that people didn't realize I hadn't prepared. But part of that is I actually had discussed the lectionary text with a Jesuit friend the day before. And so I kind of knew what he was going to preach. I mean, that's just like a little thing. Don't do what I did. But just having the gift of those friendships, I think, has really resourced me in ways that expand my vision.
And just to add to that, I mean, it's so good, Elizabeth, man. How many times have sermons come right out of just real life conversations with friends around what God's doing in our lives, and then you get to the text, and it's like, oh my goodness, the text aligns. It's amazing. Another way to apply that, particularly if you're in a context where you're trying to grow, like maybe you're in a small, struggling, or even a startup kind of a situation, where you're really kind of engaged in seeking to reach people who really don't know who Jesus is, don't know, haven't really tasted grace, is actually to invite neighbors, people in the community, just to read the Bible with you. And then, but read it with them not as a preacher or even as an evangelist, but read it with them as a listener. So say read the book of Ruth with somebody who is unfamiliar, who seems way far away from church world or whatever. Just sit down and actually just open it up and read it out loud to each other, and then ask them, what do you make of this story? Like, what resonates with the story? What stands out to you? It can be shocking how differently people who aren't familiar with these texts respond to it, and it can really enliven your own understanding of God's grace at work, and then eventually even open up conversations around Jesus as well.
So maybe another question about thinking about context. So when I did my PhD at a Jesuit school, and I would sometimes attend, not receive, but go to the 12:10 Mass at the Joan of Arc Chapel. So, you know, Marquette's not terribly religious. So if you're showing up at the middle of the day to go to Mass, you're probably pretty pious. But what always just made me laugh, I mean, I had to really repress myself some moments, was these tended to be older priests, mostly Jesuit, who would come out, and they just were trying to be, you know, connect with the youths and be super cool with them. And I'm just like looking at their faces, and they're looking at them like, what is wrong with you? Like, this is not what, like, you're making a fool of yourself. Now, this is not a sort of A or B kind of question, right? Because I think that there is something to connecting with where people at, but there's also a way in which this can become its own sort of idol, like how many sermons about whatever Radiohead or something, you know, can I do? But I mean, Paul, of course, also tries to make these connections, right? I see that you are all very religious. Let me tell you what one of your poets said this, and then he makes a foray in. So I'm interested in some of your thoughts in how to fruitful and unfruitful ways of making use of popular culture and things that are common to people, but also recognizing that what people want is something that Taylor Swift does not provide, but what only Jesus can provide.
Right.
As much as Taylor Swift is providing right now, which seems to be a lot.
So I'm going to pull on two things from the chat that I think actually are great impetuses to that. I'm sorry, Matthew, I almost like lost it because I've been to those masses too, as you know. So I think someone brings up ministering in a multicultural context. And to me, there is a huge, and we're all ministering in multicultural context of one way or another. There is a huge difference between trying to act like you belong to someone else's culture and coming to know and appreciate the other person's culture. So if I were to go up and act like I am Taylor Swift, that would be an abysmal failure. If I were to act like I was, you know, like a cool Swiftie, that would be an abysmal failure. To use that as a way to connect and say, hey, this is something that's important to the people I'm preaching to or engaging with, that's loving. And another person's comment about attending concerts and plays that the youth are being involved in, that's appreciation. And so I do think, I mean, this is kind of a cultural hot button. I think there's a big difference between appreciation and appropriation. And this comes up in any type of ministry that we do. And people sense, I mean, there's a reason the word for the year is authenticity. People know when we're fake. People know when we're trying to be something we're not. But they also know when we love them and seek to care about what they care about. And that's a fine distinction, but I think it's really crucial.
Appreciation versus appropriation. That's great.
Really good. That is really good. And I think that I mean, I think that that lines up with with a lot of the studies that are coming out around Gen Z. And my wife does a children's ministry called Storymakers, and she's done a lot of research on this. And what I mean, Gen Z, they're looking for authentic. They don't want to, it's interesting. We're always, I see these conversations oftentimes having new ways of doing church, and what they actually want are some old ways of doing church. They want to know, they want to be brought in because as their own story has failed them, and so they don't want us coming into their story. They want us to bring them into theirs, and this goes, I think, with the illustration as well. I think, when you're using like cultural illustrations, like, I mean, it's one thing, like it's not appropriation, but it's appreciation. And if you can really appreciate a Taylor Swift song, well, kudos to you, and you can definitely use it. I happen to resonate with the Twilight Zone, the Peaky Blinders and all sorts of things. And there have been some things that I'm sitting there and I'm watching the show and it really resonates with me. And I've used those as illustrations of in my sermon. For example, there's a scene in the Peaky Blinders, I believe season 3, when the main character has kind of reached the end of his rope, and he is literally in his own grave that he's dug. And at the very last minute, this hand reaches in and saves him. And it's just this beautiful illustration of salvation. But that resonates with me, and it's authentic. Now, I do want to say there can be a danger to the illustration as well. You have to be very careful with the illustration. I've listened to preachers, and they've, taken 15 minutes to lay out the illustration. Just give us Jesus, man. I don't need to know the whole plot of the movie. And so, that is so I want to say, one, the use of illustration is very powerful for roping people in. It shouldn't be your main point. And I think, but it should be authentic and not appropriated either, because the world really is looking to be grafted by the power of the Spirit through your words into this marvelous story of Jesus's redemption. So I would say that could be the case. That should be the case. But I mean, I'm loaded with them. I mean, the Twilight Zone's a great place to go for illustrations. There are all sorts of things. So. Music, but it's got to be true to you.
Yeah, I mean, my kids, I've got, my wife and I have 5 kids, 2 in college, 1 in high school, 2 in middle school. And, at some point, like 5 years ago, like something slipped where like I was kind of keeping up with them, and then something slipped and I've been behind, and it's like I get further behind every day. It's nuts. My kids don't need me necessarily to understand what bet means. I've been trying to figure this out for weeks now, and I still don't know what bet means. They've tried to explain it to me. And if you don't even know what I'm talking about, God bless you. Anyway, they don't, but what they do care about is, am I interested in them? Do I care for them? Do I love them? Am I interested in who they are? Can I laugh at myself that I don't know? Well, sometimes I can. Sometimes I'm just kind of frustrated, like, how did I get old? I didn't want to be old.
Yeah.
But I think it's what Elizabeth was saying earlier, like that the relationship and the old line is still as true today as it was then. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care.
Yeah.
On tap.
Let me echo just a shout out to Jacob's wife and Storymakers. We actually brought something home from Storymakers from the conference, a set of sort of open-ended questions for teens. And I have 2 high school kids, and we actually got it out after dinner the other night, and we did a couple of these questions together, and I'm going to tear up. We had a really beautiful 15 minutes with our high school kids talking about things that mattered to them. About the sort of future they wanted to have. My daughter talking about her desire to be a mother. It was just sort of striking to have your 17-year-old talk about something so meaningful and rich. We're getting near the end of our time. There's another question, and it dovetails with one that I had thought about putting to all of you. Marcus from St. John's Episcopal in Edinburgh asks about who sermons are for. And, having come out of the evangelical world, I had a lot of experience with the sort of seeker-sensitive approach in evangelicalism in the 80s and 90s. And, Willow Creek was probably one of the big places associated with that. So much so that Sunday morning was only for the visitor, never for the sort of Christian, and you had to come at another time to get fed. But I think that if we're thinking about a post-Christian or a post-Christian or maybe a pre-Christian context, there's a real practical question in thinking about audience. And so, I think most of us are in contexts where we're thinking about Sundays are when people who have been incorporated into the body of Jesus gather as the body to receive the body and offer themselves as the body. But there's going to be the sort of degree of formation and whether or not people are a Christian is a real open question about all the people who are going to be there. And I was talking about this in my pastoral ministry class yesterday. Pixar does this amazing job of speaking to kids and parents in this like perfect sort of polyphonous way that can be equally rich. And I'm wondering if you guys have advice in thinking about how to speak in this kind of two-track or even, multi-track polyphonous way to different sorts of people who are there. And I think this is really hard. I remember hearing, there's only one person I ever heard give an amazing children's sermon that did the Pixar thing. It like spoke to the 8-year-old and to the parents equally powerfully, but in different ways. And I just remember thinking, I do not think I could replicate this. But I think it's similarly challenging to think about different audiences. I'm wondering what sort of advice you have, and maybe things that have worked, and maybe things that like, man, this did not work. And it adjusted how I try and come and think about who I'm speaking to, who I'm preaching to.
I actually think the children's preaching model that you just gave up, Matthew, has been very helpful for me. I've spent a lot of time at preaching children's homilies. And as a theologian, that has been a really good discipline for me because we're so rewarded for using big words. And, that's our cool is like using big words and sounding really theoretical. And when I started preaching children's homilies and realized that the goal was really to preach to the adults, I have, with more or less success, taken that model into like my grown-up preaching that I'm trying to, I guess it's a Pauline metaphor, right? Like I'm trying to speak in a way that resonates with the people who are still drinking milk and those who are eating solid food. And not in like the seeker friendly model way, like fireworks, being a hip and relevant, but in a sense that if I'm preaching in a way that resonates with the people who need milk, I can add a layer that reaches the people who are eating solid food. And I think that is better, at least for me as a theologian, that works as a better discipline for myself than if I go the other way, because as soon as I start going the other way, I go up into academic theology land. So that might just be my own personal formational weakness.
That's really helpful. What about Jacob or Matthew?
Yeah, so my sermon outline doesn't look like a sermon outline. If you're familiar with the work of Dan Rome, he's probably most famous for his book, The Back of the Napkin, How to Use Little Drawings to Sell Stuff, something like that. But anyway, he has a book called Show and Tell that talks about 4 different presentations. And he presents a very simple story arc, where it's, everything's going great, then there's a challenge, and then there's a descent, and then you hit rock bottom, and you describe rock bottom, and then you kind of make your way, then there's a discovery, and you make your way up, and then there's the return, and then the lesson at the end. I think for me, my sermons ultimately, like my study and all of that work ends up going into a story arc, because what is it about Pixar? They're telling a story that hits at all these different levels. And I think there's a power to thinking of our sermons as stories and not just like an academic lecture where I'm going to move you logically through 3 points, but if you can conceptualize your sermon as a story, then that story is going to play to lots of different audiences because the story itself engages interest in different ways amongst different people. So, yeah, so I mean, there's still exegesis, exposition of the text, and all of that. But one of the great things I find about using Dan Rum's little diagram, and like literally, I've gone to the pulpit with one sheet of paper and have a hand drawn arc with my little points there. And people love it when I do that because my sermons are shorter when I just bring that up rather than like a manuscript. It's dangerous. You never know if it's going to be shorter or longer. But anyway, but one of the great things about using that is wherever the story of this text gets you to rock bottom, the discovery is always Jesus. And so the rise is always Jesus has done this for us. Jesus rose from the dead for you. Jesus has put his Holy Spirit on you. So, I mean, it becomes like you're retelling the grand theme through every text you're preaching. But I think that's one way for myself. I preach in a lot of different contexts. I most recently preached at a Spanish Pentecostal church in the Bronx, which is very different preaching through a translator. I mean, an electric service in lots of ways, and it was just an absolute blast. And you know, I preached for Jake at Cal St. G, which is a very different liturgy and a very different experience, but both places people hungry for Jesus, right? And so it's a tool that I use that helps me in different contexts go from text to the diversity within any particular audience.
I think ultimately, I mean, you know, this what is Paul's. So I was one time in a church setting where it was the drive was to go very seeker sensitive. And I'm always reminded of St. Paul, no one seeks after God, no, not one. And so quoting the prophets but he also says that there's no distinction between Jew and Gentile. And I think oftentimes we get like really worked up on making a distinction between, you know, Christian and non-Christian, or, you know, Episcopalian and non-Episcopalian. And I think, you know, but the truth is that most people, especially today, at least it's been my experience, are not coming to church because they have to. A lot of them have walked on glass to get there, whether they've been a cradle Episcopalian their whole life who's now dealing with the wife who's gotten terminal cancer, whether they are the evangelicals who've come to your church who are totally fried, and you know, they did all this stuff and nothing seemed to work out, and you're like the last door before atheism. Or the person who's just like walked off the street for the first time because the doors were open and this sort of looked interesting, but you know, maybe is dealing with the loss of a job. I mean, people coming into your church, and everybody's got an issue, and so and this is the universality of the God. It's the universality of the condition. Nothing's worked out the way I thought it would, and this becomes the universality of the message. There is one who's come to save you. You know, that's really the point of Jesus in the wilderness. You know, it's not like the 3 steps that you can use to resist Satan. The point of Jesus in the wilderness is like, here he is, the one who's finally come, you know, to say, this is the one that Adam and Eve were looking for. This is the one he is finally here, and he's for you. And you get that message across Sunday after Sunday to people whose lives are hidden, and they may not feel like they're doing that great. You'll find that the basement begins to make its way into the nave.
This has been such a rich conversation. You all should write some more books, because you were turning phrases left and right. It was just beautiful and encouraging. One of the phrases that really stuck out to me is a description of this post-Christian age. And it may be that, you know, it's not new, totally new to us, but this idea of people being adrift on their own freedom. And that part of what we have been given, and what we are ministers of, is a story that orders and brings real freedom. And it brings a freedom because it brings a person and a relationship, not an idea.
Yes.
And And I think also that phrase, the difference between appreciation of what can be shared between us and sort of gross appropriation of things that are not ours, or pretending to be someone we're not. A kind of real honesty about who we are, and an honesty about the things that that other people love. So what makes these sort of things great is that this could be twice as long and be just as enriching. I'm so grateful to each of you for making the time to do this. I'm grateful to Joe and Episcopal Parish Network for wanting to partner with the Living Church. And I'm thankful to Jacob for his parish wanting to partner with the Living Church for this conference, which drew a lot of people who had never been probably to either the parish or to a Living Church event.
That's right.
I came away encouraged. I have a number of preaching. I don't have regular responsibilities, but I have a number of sermons coming up, and I'm feeling pretty excited about the time in my calendar that I've scheduled to sit down and work on a sermon. So thank you all. God bless you. And we look forward to when we can next be with many of you and participate in these webinars. Thanks so much.
Thank you.